Hey gang, Gene Lyons here, along with my co-host, Big D, Dick Ebert.
Good evening.
And if you've been listening to our 80s and 90s movie podcast, Shat the Movies, or any of our TV podcasts, including Game of Thrones, Westworld, True Detective, American Gods, and Taboo, you probably know we're very excited to start yet another HBO series launching this fall, Watchmen. And if you're not familiar with Watchmen, it started as a graphic novel from comic book genius Alan Moore and exploded onto the big screen in a 2009 film adaptation that not everybody loved, but I sure did. The TV show picks up in the same alternate universe where the superheroes are outlaws, and it features some of the same characters, but a very different cast and storyline. Watchmen was created and developed by Damon Lindelof for HBO, with Lindelof serving as the executive producer and writer. And there will be 9 episodes in the first season.
Yeah, I've never been a big comic book guy other than G.I. Joe when I was real little. But for me, Lindelof and The Leftovers, I mean, it's one of my top 3 series. I loved what he did with Lost even till the end. He was the executive producer and the joint showrunner. Him and HBO combined, I don't see any way this goes wrong. And then with the success recently, we were talking about earlier with Amazon's The Boys, I think there's more of an appetite for an alternate take on the Marvel, Avengers, glossy, happy superheroes. So I think something dark could really hit with the audience.
And if superhero things aren't really your cup of tea, stick with us on this for a couple reasons. One, if you saw the 2009 Watchmen, one of the most common complaints was people at that time were not ready for this kind of a comic book movie. It was very, very dark. And this series promises to get a lot darker. It's set in Tulsa, Oklahoma in 2019. There's no internet, there's no smartphones, and it's 34 years after the graphic novel ends. You've got Robert Redford starring as the longest serving president of the U.S. He was elected in 1992, and it deals with all sorts of stuff, including militant groups, white supremacists, and it promises to be very, very violent, very, very dark, and satisfying for a guy like me.
Yeah, I think Lindelof also has a history with comic books. If I'm not mistaken, I think he wrote a 6-issue series with Marvel. I think it was like Wolverine and the Hulk. So he has some experience. He's also done some good sci-fi films, Aliens vs. Cowboys, Prometheus, then that Into the Darkness Star Trek movie, and the not so good Tomorrowland. But I think everything he's done, especially coming off the heels of The Leftovers, I'm excited. I think it's going to be good. HBO hasn't misled us, the exception of maybe the end of season 8 of Game of Thrones, but that's debatable. You still can't question the quality. You can't question the dedication that they put into all the series they do. So this will have all the resources, the talent to be a successful series. And now let's just see if they can put it all together.
Also co-hosting the podcast with us will be our old friend, the King B. He co-hosted American Gods and True Detective and a few episodes of Shat the Movies. King B and I go way back on The Watchmen. He actually gave me the graphic novel when we were teenagers. And, we were big DC fans at the time. He hands me this book and he actually wrote in the first page of it, like, this is the greatest book you're ever going to read. I want you to have it. And it quickly became my favorite comic book. It's been with me for years, and I'm a massive fan. He is incredibly knowledgeable about Alan Moore's work, the creator of Watchmen. And the King Bee has more comic books than any human being I know. He spends his Wednesdays at the comic shop. This is a guy we need on the podcast.
Yes, he owns more comic books and has more knowledge about Alan Moore than any adult should have. He has no reason spending this much time to it. So if we wanted a subject matter expert, I think King B is perfect.
The way we're going to cover Watchmen is a little bit different than we did Game of Thrones, if you're joining us from Game of Thrones, and a little bit different than we do Shat the Movies. So Watchmen drops on HBO October 20th. Before then, we'll be doing a preview episode to get you kind of caught up in this world. Definitely encourage you to read the graphic novel or at least watch the 2009 movie. It is 3 hours long, 3.5 hours if you have the ultimate cut, but it's worth the time to sit down and do it. Raj and I just did it last week, and we'll be doing weekly deep dives that will drop every Tuesday. So 1 episode per episode of Watchmen for the entire run.
Yeah, and what we did for Game of Thrones was we had to put our movies podcast, Shat the Movies, on hold because we were doing 3 episodes a week. We did an instant take, a deep dive, and then a listener email portion. The amount of time that took, we had to shut Shat the Movies down. And we have a dedicated large audience of Shat the Movies listeners right now. We just crossed 1 million downloads for Shat the Movies alone. So we don't want to abandon you this time. So the plan is that Roger and I will continue on with movies so that there's not a break in movie coverages weekly. We'll take on a few hosts here and there, co-hosts to bridge the gap. Maybe Gene could jump in, or we're going to jump over to the Watchmen. So that way we don't forget about the movies audience, because that's near and dear to my heart. That was our first podcast. And I think that way we can try to meet both audiences and keep everybody happy, and we won't have to stop one or the other.
And huge thanks to Big D for setting up yet another podcast for us. Each different show that we do has its own podcast. This poor guy has to set up the website, the feeds, and all that stuff. So huge thank you to Big D for letting us do yet another TV podcast.
Well, I mean, at this point, this is podcast 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So I've done this 7 times. And if you're wondering why this episode will be super short, the point is, once you set up a feed, you have to have some piece of content. Then you contact iTunes, then you contact Pandora, iHeartRadio, Spotify, and then you create all the feeds. So this is just serving as the first thing down the chute. We're priming the pumps, getting everything ready. And then when the preview podcast comes out, hopefully you're subscribed, and then it's just off to the races from there.
So if you're joining us from any of our TV podcasts or Shat the Movies, thank you so much for listening to this recording. And please, please, please go over to Shat on TV Watchmen, subscribe to the podcast, and then join us on October 15th for the Watchmen preview episode of Shat on TV Watchmen.